When we first laid eyes on the house, it felt like a dream come true. The grand Victorian structure stood proudly at the end of a tree-lined street, its weathered exterior whispering stories of a bygone era. My wife, Claire, and I fell in love immediately. It was exactly the kind of place where we wanted to raise our son, Liam, a house filled with character, charm, and the promise of memories to be made. Liam was ecstatic about his new room, running from corner to corner as we moved in, his laughter echoing through the empty halls. It was a fresh start for our family, a chance to leave behind the chaos of the city and settle into something calmer, more grounded. But the house had secrets. It was on our second day, while unpacking boxes in the basement, that we found it, a false wall tucked behind an old cabinet. Claire was the first to notice the odd seams in the plaster. Curiosity got the better of us, and with a bit of effort, we managed to pry it open. Behind it was a small hidden room. The air inside was stale, thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The room was furnished as if it belonged to a child. An old wooden bed pushed against the wall, a pile of faded toys in one corner, and a small desk with a cracked leather diary sitting on top. The diary belonged to a boy named Samuel. Its entries were simple at first, describing games he played, chores he did, and how much he loved the family dog. But as we flipped through the pages, the tone changed. Samuel began to write about noises in the night, scratching behind the walls, whispers that didn't belong to anyone in the house. The last entry was scrawled and frantic. "They're here. Mother says to hide, but I'm scared. I don't want to go away." Claire closed the diary with trembling hands, and we exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. We tried to laugh it off, an overactive imagination, a child's way of coping with something mundane, but the room left us both unsettled. That night, Liam was restless. He tossed and turned in bed, muttering in his sleep. Claire and I chalked it up to the excitement of the move, but the next morning, something felt different. Liam seemed off. At breakfast, he asked me to pass the porridge. He'd never called it that before. It was a small thing, but it caught me off guard. Later, while Claire and I unpacked, he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, drawing intently. He showed us his picture. It was our house, but not as it looked now. The roof had a different shape, the windows were larger, and the yard was fenced in with wrought iron. There were people too, figures standing in the yard, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. "Who are they, buddy?" I asked. "They're the ones who lived here before," he said matter-of-factly, before going back to his drawing. Claire and I exchanged uneasy looks. Over the next few days, Liam's behavior became stranger. He started humming old songs we didn't recognize, speaking in phrases that sounded archaic, and avoiding certain parts of the house, particularly the basement. At night, he woke up crying, saying Samuel didn't want to be alone. We read more of the diary, desperate for answers. Samuel described his family's gradual unraveling. His mother became withdrawn, and his father was angry and paranoid. The noises in the house grew louder, the whispers more insistent. Samuel wrote about seeing a shadowy figure in the corner of his room, watching him with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The entries stopped abruptly. Things escalated after that. Liam began sleepwalking, his small feet padding down the hall at all hours of the night. We'd find him standing in front of the basement door, staring at it as if waiting for someone to open it. One evening, Claire found another drawing, this one of the hidden room. It was frighteningly detailed, down to the smallest toy scattered on the floor. "We need help," she said, her voice trembling. We reached out to a local historian, an older man named Mr. Harding, who specialized in the town's history. When we told him the address, his face went pale. "That house," he began, shaking his head. "Families don't stay there long." He told us about the house's grim history. It had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family who vanished without a trace. Over the years, other families moved in, and strange things began to happen. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, stories of hauntings. The diary belonged to one of the last families to live there before it was abandoned for decades. We showed him Liam's drawings and the diary. Harding confirmed the drawings were accurate to how the house looked over a century ago. "Your son," he hesitated. "He's connected to something in that house." That night, the house came alive. We heard it first in the walls, scratching like claws dragging across the wood. Then came the whispers, louder and clearer than before. They seemed to echo from every corner, overlapping voices that made no sense but chilled me to the bone. Liam was screaming. We rushed to his room and found him standing in the middle of it, pointing at the corner. "He's here! He's here!" he sobbed. Claire grabbed him while I stood frozen, staring at the empty corner. But it wasn't empty. The air shimmered faintly, and a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness shifted. I don't know where I found the courage, but I grabbed the diary and shouted, "What do you want?" The whispers stopped. The house fell silent. Then, the pages of the diary flipped on their own, stopping at the final entry. "Leave." Claire and I didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed Liam, stuffed what little we could into bags, and ran out the door. We drove straight to a motel and never went back. I didn't even try to sell the house. It wasn't worth the risk. To this day, it stands empty, its windows dark and its walls silent. Sometimes I wonder if another family will come along, drawn to its charm like we were. This is my mother's story, one she told me late at night when the shadows crept into her voice and she couldn't meet my eyes. She made me promise never to repeat it, but here I am, breaking that promise. It was the year before she met my father. She was in her late 20s, newly independent and full of dreams. She'd just purchased a quaint little house in a quiet neighborhood, a home that oozed charm with its ivy-covered walls and antique stained glass windows. The real estate agent had called it a hidden gem, and my mother initially agreed. The house seemed to have a soul of its own. The creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper, and the wind whistling through the eaves was almost musical. But as she began to settle in, that charm began to feel heavier, like the house was watching her. The first strange incident happened a week after she moved in. She was in the kitchen unpacking a box of plates when she heard a loud thud from upstairs. Rushing up, she found a book lying in the middle of the hallway, a book she was certain she had left on a shelf. She dismissed it as her forgetfulness, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The real trouble began when she discovered the compartment in the attic. The attic had been one of the selling points of the house, a spacious, dusty room with beams that crisscrossed like the skeleton of some ancient beast. She'd been storing old furniture up there when she tripped over a loose floorboard. Curious, she pried it up and found a shallow compartment hidden beneath. Inside was a bundle of yellowed letters, tied neatly with a faded ribbon. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged in places, but they were readable. Each letter was addressed to someone who had lived in the house decades before, and each one ended abruptly, as if the writer had been cut off mid-thought. The first letter was dated 1925 and spoke of a young artist who had just moved into the house. She wrote about the peculiar noises she heard at night, scratching like claws on wood, coming from within the walls. The letter ended with her planning to investigate the basement. The second was from 1947, written by a schoolteacher who described how her belongings would go missing, only to reappear in places she never would have left them. She mentioned a recurring nightmare of a figure standing at the foot of her bed. The third letter chilled my mother to the bone. It was from 1972, written by a nurse who had recently divorced and moved into the house to start over. She detailed strange sensations, feeling watched, hearing whispers calling her name, and the overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone. My mother realized, with a sinking dread, that each of these women shared eerie similarities with her. The artist loved to paint in watercolors. My mother had just started experimenting with them. The school teacher had been an avid reader of Gothic novels, just like my mother. And the nurse's handwriting looked eerily similar to hers, as if they could have been written by the same hand. As she read through the letters, small disturbances in the house escalated. Lights flickered. Objects moved just out of her sight. Her keys disappeared one morning, only to be found hours later on the attic floor, even though she hadn't been up there in days. One night, she woke up to the sensation of someone breathing near her ear. Her bedroom was freezing, despite the radiator clanking away. The next morning, she found a smudged handprint on her bathroom mirror. It wasn't hers. Terrified, she began to piece together the timeline. Each letter seemed to hint at the writer's fate, though none outright explained what had happened to them. She scoured old records at the library and found something horrifying. Every woman who had written those letters had gone missing. No bodies were ever found. No explanations were ever given. They had simply vanished, leaving behind lives, jobs, and friends. Her research led her to the house's original owner, a man named Edgar Lane. He'd built the house in the early 1900s, but after his wife's death, he'd become a recluse. Local legends painted him as a man obsessed with the occult, conducting strange rituals in his basement, though nothing was ever proven. He too had disappeared one day, leaving the house abandoned until it was sold years later. As she uncovered more about Edgar, the occurrences in the house grew more sinister. One night she woke to find every window in the house wide open, letting in the freezing winter air. She was sure she had locked them before bed. Another time, she returned home to find her paintings torn from their frames, the canvas slashed as if by unseen claws. The final straw came when she found a new letter in the attic. It was addressed to her. The handwriting was hers. The date on the letter was the following day. It described everything that had happened to her since she moved in. The noises, the shadows, the oppressive presence. And it ended with a chilling sentence. "He's coming for me tonight." She didn't wait to find out who he was. Grabbing what she could carry, she fled the house that same night and never looked back. She left most of her belongings behind, including the letters. She stayed with a friend and put the house up for sale immediately, refusing to step foot in it again. When I asked her why she never told the police or anyone else about what had happened, she just shook her head. "Some things," she said, "you can't explain, and some things you don't want to." Years later, I found myself curious about the house. I tried to look it up, but it wasn't there. The address existed, but the house didn't. It was as if it had been wiped away, leaving nothing behind but an empty lot. It started as a dream, a quaint little cottage on the edge of town, far from the chaos of city life. Ivy crept up its stone walls, and the garden buzzed with bees and butterflies, promising the serenity we'd always longed for. Emily and I couldn't believe our luck when we found it. Newly married and eager to start our lives together, it felt like the perfect escape. We wanted to document every moment of our fresh start. Emily loved photography, and she insisted on capturing the little details that made the house ours: her favorite chair by the fireplace, the old wooden beams in the kitchen, and the view from our bedroom window. The first few days were blissful, filled with laughter and the kind of excitement only new beginnings can bring. It wasn't until we reviewed the photos that unease began to creep in. "Look at this," Emily said one evening, frowning at her laptop screen. She showed me a picture of us standing in the living room, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. But in the background, near the corner of the room, was a faint shadow, a figure that shouldn't have been there. "It's probably just a trick of the light," I said, trying to brush it off. Emily nodded, but her fingers lingered on the touchpad, zooming in on the shadow. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably human-shaped. Over the next few days, the figure appeared in more photos. Always faint, always just behind one of us. But there. "Maybe it's the camera," I suggested, though doubt gnawed at me. Emily's camera was new, and she was meticulous about her equipment. "I don't think so," she said quietly. It wasn't until the figure became sharper, its edges more defined, its shape clearer, that we couldn't ignore it any longer. "Let's look into the history of this place," Emily suggested. The local library was small but surprisingly well-stocked. We pored over old records, newspapers, and photographs, piecing together the story of our cottage. It had been built in the early 1900s and passed through several owners before falling into disrepair. Then, in the 1980s, a reclusive artist named Victor Halloway purchased it. Halloway was known for his dark, unsettling paintings, which featured twisted landscapes and shadowy figures. He rarely left the cottage, and neighbors spoke of strange noises and lights coming from his home late at night. Then, one day he vanished without a trace. "Do you think it's him?" Emily asked, her voice hushed. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it feels like we're not alone in that house." The nights became restless after that. Doors creaked open on their own, and we'd hear faint whispers in rooms we knew were empty. Objects moved, not far but enough to notice. Emily started waking up in the middle of the night, swearing she'd seen someone standing at the foot of our bed. One evening, while clearing out the small loft above the bedroom, I found a trap door. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading up to an attic we hadn't known existed. "Emily, you need to see this," I called out. The attic was eerily untouched. Dust blanketed everything, but it was clear no one had been there for years. The room was filled with canvases, paintings that made my stomach churn. Each one depicted the same shadowy figure we'd seen in our photos. In some, it loomed over a bed. In others, it stood at the edge of a dark forest or reached out with clawed hands toward an unseen victim. Emily found a leather-bound journal on a shelf. She flipped it open, and her face turned pale. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "The shadow won't leave. It watches, always watching. I tried to capture it on canvas, thinking that might contain it, but it grows stronger with each stroke. I fear I am losing myself to it." The entries grew more erratic, detailing Victor's descent into madness. He described the shadow as a malevolent force that attached itself to him, feeding off his fear and isolation. His final entry was chilling. "The ritual must work. If it doesn't, God help whoever lives here next." "What ritual?" Emily asked, flipping through the pages, but there was nothing else. That night, the shadow appeared. I was brushing my teeth when I saw it in the bathroom mirror. It stood behind me, tall and featureless, its presence so overwhelming that I froze. When I spun around, there was nothing there, but the chill in the air lingered. Emily screamed from the bedroom. I found her backed into a corner, pointing at the window. "It was there! Outside!" she cried. We couldn't keep ignoring it. Desperate, we scoured the journal for clues about the ritual. Victor had written about a cleansing involving fire and salt, symbols meant to sever the connection between the shadow and the house. "I don't think this is just about the house," Emily said. "I think it's attached to us now." We gathered supplies and prepared to confront whatever it was. Following Victor's instructions, we lit candles in the attic and sprinkled salt in a protective circle around us. The air grew heavy as we recited the words Victor had written. Shadows danced on the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Then, the whispers started, low and guttural, as if the house itself were alive. The shadow materialized, towering over us, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. "You're not welcome here," I shouted, throwing salt at it. The figure recoiled, but it didn't disappear. It surged forward, knocking over a candle and breaking the circle. The room erupted in chaos. Paintings fell, glass shattered, and the whispers became deafening. Emily grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Now!" We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The cottage loomed behind us, its windows dark and unwelcoming. "We're leaving," I said. "Tonight." We packed what little we could and drove away, leaving the cottage and its secrets behind. Months later, I saw an article about the cottage being put up for sale. The photos showed it looking just as picturesque as when we first saw it. But I knew better. Somewhere inside, the shadow is waiting. Thanks for watching. Good nightmares and stay scared.